everyone. How's it going? Whoops. Nice.
Just waking you up a little bit. Let's get you out of the meditative trance that you were just in. All right.
Right.
I'm so impressed to see so many of you here bright and early, looking fresher than I anticipated since we're in Berlin. But, maybe tonight?
It's not working.
Oh, you can't hear me at all? What about now? Can you hear me more? Yeah, now? Hello, hello. Just sing a little song. You got me. I think everybody's got me now. Okay. Yeah, what I said was I'm very impressed to see so many of you here looking a lot fresher than I expected since we're in Berlin. And I think maybe tonight will be the night that you're a little bit more fragile in the morning than the day after. But let's see how that goes. Thanks for having us here today. Let's maybe kick off with a little story, since I imagine you might be a little bit fragile, let's say. So the beginning of our story with Do No Harm, not so much the framework, but the idea in itself, or our familiarity with the idea, it started really in a context of frustration. So that's probably why the first version of what we're about to take you through today wasn't a framework, it was a manifesto. That's exactly, it comes with the connotations that you're imagining. And that's also because in 2018, when we started thinking about this, we really felt like we were the only people in the room that were talking about it at any kind of given time. And obviously that wasn't the case, it felt like that, but since then we've understood that there have been kind of a lot of people around the world, thought leaders that have inspired us, but also lots of people in our communities who've been talking about ethics and design. And it started first as a bit of a whisper, and then it developed into a rush and a roar. And so here we are on stage doing a keynote. And for us, this represents this topic evolving from an individual concern, I'd say, concern about the people that we're designing for and with, to what we like to think of as a collective consciousness. And with that, we're going to take you through another story. Sorry, by the way, that my voice is like this. I wish I could say that I was partying last night, but I'm just a bit sick. So let's stay in 2018. We started a project, myself and Giulia, with the Undocumented Migrants Health Center, and specifically with the Women's Center that's attached to the bigger health center. As you might imagine, the center is the only place in Norway where undocumented women could access care from this particular place. Now, undocumented people are in a vulnerable situation for lots of reasons. They could include having poor physical health, poor mental health, no fixed housing, economic issues, not being able to move around freely, of course. But really the biggest issue, and the reason why the clinic was set up in the first place, was basically because they're undocumented and at risk of deportation. So just to make that clear, if any of the clinic's patients were stopped by state authorities, they could be deported immediately. Now, bear in mind that the most common services that the Women's Clinic was providing, or is providing, are antenatal care and access to safe terminations. And then you get a sense of the urgency of both the needs of these people and, of course, the risks involved. So on the one hand, obviously, we're working in a design context. We really need to understand the needs and the obstacles that these patients are, or potential patients are facing. But on the other, even trying to identify them, even trying to find a lot of the people that need access to this clinic could put them in an immense amount of danger. Now, applying Do No Harm in this context, for us, was a necessity right from the beginning. And as you might have heard in the introduction, both myself and Giulia, we have experience with Do No Harm, both in clinical, humanitarian, and academic worlds. And we were really looking for a lens to adapt it to this design project. So we started with a very, very broad macro measure. And that was to design the entire research process without having to interact directly with a single direct user. And instead, we reflected on acquiring information from other sources. And just to go into a little bit more depth here, so we focused on a triangulation method. We started with desk research to gather information about the experience of migrants and undocumented people in new settings. We involved expert users to represent both the kind of reproductive health policies in Norway, but also the legal rights of undocumented people, to get a picture of the bigger structural issues, even though we were not able to change any of them through this project explicitly. And then we spoke with health personnel at the clinic. Obviously, these were the people interacting directly with these users to kind of extract some of the needs. Finally, we relied on proxy users. If you're not familiar with proxy users, they're people who, they're not the exact users of the service that you're looking into, but they share key experience characteristics. And so you get a plausible kind of comparative data set there. And for example, in our case, this included former undocumented people whose legal status had since changed. So they understood that experience, they could communicate about it, but actually talking to us wouldn't put them in any explicit danger. And just to clarify these 4 points, these are measures responding to the risk of direct interaction with the users, right? And we'll come back to this throughout the rest of the presentation. Now, the reason we wanted to start with this personal example to illustrate how we apply do no harm day to day in our design work was to show you the texture of it, and hopefully to make you see that the actions are pretty familiar. Then there's no kind of mystique around the things that you do as a result of considering these risks. And actually, for many of you, do no harm might share many of the qualities of good ethical research practices, and it is, basically. So let's go back a step, and let's dive into the building blocks. Like, what does it actually mean? Where does it come from? And why do we call it what we call it? So you might have heard of do no harm before, and if you have, chances are this is where you've heard about it before. So it comes from the Hippocratic Oath. This is the oath I took when I was training to be a nurse in London. It's a vow of ethical practice, and it's historically taken by healthcare physicians and wider clinical staff these days. So the oath says, it's pretty old language, the physician must be able to tell the antecedents, that means what happened before, know the present, and foretell the future. They must mediate these things and have 2 special effects in view with regard to disease, namely to do good or to do no harm. And that or is very, very important, and I hope it becomes clear as we move through. So what does that mean for you? Let's extract a little bit. It means before intervening in a particular situation, we need to look at the broader context to identify risks that might occur on individuals, communities, the social fabric, and the environment through our actions. It also means mitigating those potential negative effects with appropriate measures to counterbalance them. Lastly, weighing the potential harm against your objectives to understand how to move forward. This weighing process is central to do no harm. Think about medics. They're often weighing a kind of life-changing and also kind of risky intervention against the potential outcomes, right? You don't go for open heart surgery unless you can prove that the outcome is potentially of more benefit than the risks involved with doing that. So there are 2 main points with do no harm in terms of applying it to your practice. It's about risks and it's about measures, right? So you're identifying risks and then you're coming up with appropriate measures for those risks. Every action you take, including putting someone in a room to interview them, that's an intervention, right? In the language that we use, it's an intervention. You're causing a slight shift. It's a slight change. I like to think of, those old films, maybe this shows how old I am, it's kind of 90s films, where they say, when you time travel, don't touch anything, because if you touch anything, something might change and you'll cause some shift that has, ramifications for years in the future. It's kind of the same with do no harm. The idea is you've put yourself in a situation and you've put your participants in a situation that they wouldn't have ordinarily been in had you have not kind of created it or engineered it. So you own the consequences of all the actions in that space now. You're responsible for them, basically. But don't be too daunted. It's not that scary. So moving into the recipients of harm, they can be anything from a single user, and the harmful effects here could happen on direct and indirect users' well-being, mental, physical health, as well as the consent and privacy, as we've seen in the example previously mentioned. They could happen on a community level. So in this case, this could manifest as reinforcing harmful stereotypes and causing friction between different communities. So maybe handing power to one community over another and the kind of outcomes that creates. Obviously, the natural environment, or at least I hope obviously, harmful effects here could include significant impacts on carbon emissions, exploitative and extractive practices, and irresponsible use of resources, to name a few. And lastly, the wider global context within which we all live and work. So this is a bit more complex, obviously, but I think we all have a lot of experience these days in connecting different ecosystems and understanding those dynamics, and that's where this sits. And at this level, we're talking about negative impact on society and the social, economic, and political systems underpinning it. So we're really touching this idea of reinforcing structural inequalities with our work. And we also need to think of time as a really important aspect. So immediate harm can happen at the time or right after something is taking place, an intervention that you're maybe in charge of. But also, it can happen long after your intervention has ended. So think about years and years after a solution which you've designed has been launched. That's also a potential harm that could be linked to your practices, and it's something we need to think about. Obviously, this is not, I'm using the word obviously very much, maybe it's not obvious at 9:45 in the morning, but just humor me. It's not an exhaustive list of what type of risks we need to keep in mind, but it's a high-level overview considering what, as a society, we define as harm right now. Moving on to the measures. Once there's a risk that's been identified, we just need to add measures to mitigate that identified harm. So just a quick note, because we've had this question in the past. By measures, we mean actions to take, not measurements. They exist in a kind of different plane. Measures can be macro and micro, depending on what the focus of the action actually is. So a macro measure is like the one I described with the women's clinic. It could be a principle that can guide your entire process. So, we decide we're not interacting with any direct users because actually that puts them at more harm than the potential benefit of interacting with us. But it can also be like a tiny micro measure. So it can be like a specific practical tweak in your work. So maybe setting up your interview space in a different way. So it's less daunting for your interviewees to say, you know what, actually I'm not comfortable, I'd like to leave. And in case it's not abundantly clear, and I think sometimes it isn't, which is why we put this slide in, we want to underline that do no harm doesn't mean do nothing. Doing nothing is also a potential source of harm. Do no harm is not about disengaging from a situation or from an action just because it's complex. It's about engaging with that complexity. It's active and it's intentional. And we want you to bear in mind that also in humanitarian and clinical settings, not intervening in a life-saving situation can also be disastrous and incredibly harmful. So although we may not feel that in design contexts, we're working in such an urgent kind of environment, not intervening in a project or a setting because you think this is super complex and it requires a lot of thinking, that's also not the answer, at least where we're concerned. So if there's nothing else you take away from this, please remember, do no harm is generative. It's not restrictive. It's not supposed to be a restrictive framework. It's supposed to be a generative one.
Okay. Now that we know a little bit more about what do no harm means, how does it connect to design? And I'm pretty sure that you're all already starting to see the overlapping between these two, or like the Venn diagram, but let's unpack it a little further. So design is the process by which the politics of one world, often white, middle class, and privileged, become the constraints of another. And in fact, as designers, we craft products, services, and systems that impact everyone in society. So let's look at the Apple AirTag, which has been glorified as a useful helper in locating lost luggage in overwhelmed airports. However, it has also facilitated the control of a partner's movements without their knowledge, which is unfortunately a common scenario in abusive relationships. And really, this could apply to any other IoT products. And sometimes I think that as designers, we see ourselves as neutral forces because we are simply facilitating the process forward. Though who we are, our belief system have a big impact on what and how we design. And in the book Design Justice, Sasha Costanza-Chock writes, the affordances of a designed object or system disproportionately reduce opportunities for already oppressed groups of people while enhancing the life opportunities of dominant groups, independently of whether designers intend this outcome. So who we decide to center, what insights we prioritize, what decisions we take throughout the design process are choices that we make and are shaped by who we are and how we move through the world and how the world looks back at us. So all of them in some form have repercussions on users, the environment, and wider society. And going a little bit more in the nitty-gritty of what we do, as designers, we also engage a lot with users of our solutions across a diversity of activities. Could be contextual interviews, could be co-creation sessions. These are just examples. And this is a pretty established practice done by kind of who call themselves design practitioners and not. So we really need to be considerate of how we involve users to avoid crafting a process that just aims to extract data from them and discard them once we got what we need. Or even worse, re-traumatizing users by inadvertently asking triggering questions. Because of course, our mission is to get specific information out of them. So with this in mind, and my face 5 years younger, we want to share a do no harm incident that happened to us while running a research activity. And analysis of past incidents, even though extremely painful because it's not nice to look at your own mistakes, are a key asset in do no harm. And the reason why we really dedicate time to do this is because we want to arrive better equipped and better prepared at forecasting risks in the future. And it's also a reminder that having a do no harm mindset includes reacting in the moment and managing unexpected situations. So in this case, the client was a big Scandinavian bank, and the project was about understanding and better responding to customer needs and also insecurities when buying a new property, a new home. So while planning the interviews, we wrote our research guide, considering mainly the positive scenarios connecting to buy a new home, like becoming more independent, new beginnings, starting a family. But of course, when we started running interviews, we encountered all of the more complicated context of our participants, like divorce, bereavement, downsizing, financial issues. And sadly, there's no perfect way to respond to an unexpected incident, but an understanding of do no harm means responding to the immediate needs of the participant as best as you can. So in this case, what we did was to pause the interview, give some time to the participant to collect themselves, have a breather, ask whether they were okay to continue, and really reinforcing the offer that we would have withdrawn any data collected in the interview until that point. And really, when a do no harm incident happens, the focus is how you respond to it. And as designers, when we engage also with users across research and designing activities, we sometimes get to decide the space and the type of interactions that we will hold with them. So it's important to set them up mindfully to avoid exacerbating hierarchy between designers and participants, because as much as maybe we don't like to admit it, there is a power dynamic at play. So instead, we want to aim at creating a fluid and safe space where participants can feel at ease and more in control, both of themselves and of their information that they're going to share with us. A good and shocking example to illustrate this point is the Milgram experiment. And in the study, an authority figure ordered participants to deliver what they believed were dangerous electrical shocks to another person. Please don't do this at home. The experiment is controversial, to say the least, and you can read more about it online, but it does suggest that people are highly influenced into obedience by who they perceive to be authority figures. So in analysis, for example, the participants cited the lab coat of the experimenter as a key factor to associate them with authority, even though the experimenters had never called themselves doctors, scientists, or specialists. And consent is top of mind across the design landscape and thankfully in other pockets of society. And as designers, I think we are becoming more and more aware that consent is an ongoing practice rather than a checklist at the start of a conversation. And in parallel, though, informed consent goes beyond verbal cues and needs to be reinforced behaviorally, too. And as we said before, we know that you might already take some of these precautions, but in our experience, the background and rationale is a bit less known. And finally, as designers, we get to tell and bring to life people's stories that we have encountered throughout our process in different formats and media. So we need to be aware that the type of language and imagery we use to build our storytelling could end up perpetuating dominant narratives or stereotypes, which can also be harmful. So for the clinic project we mentioned at the start, when working on different presentations and the final reports, we made the point to choose images which challenged assumptions that the white or male actor is always the healthcare professional, and the person in need is always a woman or a person of color. So all these different aspects we have touched upon until now, I think brings us to a realization of a truism, that design is an act of power. So as designers, we need to be aware of how we use it. But now the framework. Okay, so in the past 5 years of developing this framework, we have seen an increasing awareness in the landscape, both from design students, practitioners, towards ethics and responsible design. And we seem to all agree that the discipline really needs to evolve into a safer and more conscientious version of itself. So this means we need to adopt approaches to effectively forecast and prevent harm, as well as respond to it when necessary. And the Do No Harm framework could be a way to help us do that. So the framework is a practical approach to have a guided dialogue and shared awareness around potential negative consequences that might impact people, the environment, and wider society through our actions, through our work. And when we say shared awareness, we mean like the wider team. And of course, it was first developed with kind of a design context in mind. But what we really want to underline is that it can be used both by who call themselves designers and not. The point is really to have the right expertise on the topic early on, because it's going to facilitate you mapping risks, potential risks. Okay, just before I explain this slide, we had to use we ended up using the double diamond, which I know is controversial for some, but this is just a simplification of a design process. No design process is linear, and no process is neatly divided into 4 steps. Having said that, yes, the framework can be used across the entire design process. From how we define each project or initiative at its start, how we conduct research, how we develop an idea, and how we implement a solution, maintain it, or communicate about it. Because, of course, the potential harm you might need to consider will be different depending on where you are in the process. So the framework, high level, wants to answer to questions like, what are the boundaries of the harm to consider in relation to the challenge they are working on? What is the role of the team and how to best equip it at preventing harm? How to identify risks beyond an individual and user-centric focus? How to move forward when there is a big list of risks, but you have limited time, and how to craft measures, actions to mitigate the prioritized risks and ensure that they will be taken forward. Okay, practically speaking, how does this look? So at the beginning, it's important to define the areas that will or might be impacted by the challenge you're working on. And this means discussing what user groups, communities, a level of environment, and wider context you will need to consider throughout the work. So the recipient of harms that we mentioned at the start. And these definitions are important because they act as boundaries to be specific about what to focus on while assessing risks and coming up with measures later on. And of course, these definitions are not and cannot be static, because the more you work on something, the more you understand its implications. But it's a great step to start tuning into the work. And just as importantly, the team will spend some time self-reflecting on its own setup. Among other things, considering what identities are present or lacking, and what previous experience and capabilities the team members can build on. This can bring to the surface the existence of bias and blind spots, which we all have, and that need to be thought through, and the potential lack of knowledge around the topic that needs to be brought in. So at this point, you can start identifying potential harm. And we know that for some people it can be a little difficult to start. So we created a collection of risk prompts in the shape of questions to support you mapping risks across the recipients of harm. And the risk prompts are also tailored depending on which part of the design process you are in. So, for example, if you're at research phase, a risk prompt could be, considering the topic and the research activity you're planning to run, what could be triggering for participants? So you can adjust your research activity to be more considerate and to engage with users with care. If you are at ideation phase, an example of a risk prompt could be, what's the worst case scenario the idea could lead to? So you can stress test the concept you're working on beyond the happy path in good conditions, which sometimes we get a little stuck on. So at this point, you might be looking at a big list of potential risks. It's not always the case. If the risk list is small, which is also nice, you can go straight to come up with measures. But if you have a big list, considering your time, budget constraints, and definitions of areas of impact, you might want to prioritize them so you can focus on the most pressing ones. And we suggest to map out all the risks you've identified across two main axes. One being the most critical from a social and environmental perspective, and the other one being the most likely to happen. So with a list of prioritized risks, now it's the moment to establish actions that will mitigate the harm that could happen. And measures can be of different nature and size, can be macro and micro, as we saw at the start. It really depends on the challenge that you're working on. But to create those, we often rely on internal knowledge, past experience, and also investigating how others have handled similar scenarios. And finally, to ensure ownership and accountability, measures should be allocated to relevant members of the team, of the wider team, to act upon them. So now that the framework is a little more clear, let's look how we've applied it in a project in Design It. So this year, Design It has collaborated with 5 different municipalities in a project called New to Nordland. Nordland, as you can see here, is a beautiful region in the northern part of Norway. And if you like cold, darkness, quiet, it's your place. Also, it's one of the least populated areas in Europe, so they really need you. And its community is decreasing, so it's really, they really need you. But the region has really ambitious plans to develop across a range of sectors. Now I'm realizing Nordland hasn't paid us to promote the region towards the end. But yeah, to achieve this, Nordland is highly dependent on new people bringing unique skills, which are easier to be found internationally rather than nationally, since the population is so small. But data shows that 20% of international Nordlander live within the first year and 40% by year 4. So the project aimed to improve the experience for internationals in Nordland, to assist employers in finding necessary competencies, and to support newcomers, their families, because they also get to decide whether to stay in a place or not, and of course the local communities to develop sustainably over time. So the broad umbrella risk that we've identified was that the interaction between the majority and minoritized groups within the same community requires both parts to understand one another through dialogue and openness. Though, since the majority has more power than the minoritized groups, It was key to spotlight possible prejudice and impact of stereotyping and discrimination that an international Nurlander might face in their interactions with the local culture and society. So the measures we put in place were to actively maintain attention on these themes throughout the process, and we kind of added along the entire design, along the entire design process. But in this example, we're going to focus on how we handled it at ideation phase, when we ran 2 co-creation sessions with participants representing the lived experience of international Nurlander, people working in the local community and across different municipalities. So basically, we managed to have representatives from both the minoritized and majority group. And in these workshops, we asked participants to think about questions like, how could the idea exclude or marginalize specific groups of people? Or how could the idea reinforce existing stereotypes? And we also had other questions focusing on discrimination and power dynamics. Okay, at the start, participants were a little startled because, of course, they didn't expect to be confronted with such big questions when they were doing a workshop with designers using colorful Post-its. But nevertheless, they really managed to review their ideas, considering these new inputs, injecting these inputs in them, and making them more inclusive towards an international Nurlander. And the ideas are now in the process of being prototyped and tested over 3 months. And the same do no harm themes are very much embedded in this step as well. So.
Okay, I wait for my mic to turn on. There we go, thank you. That was smooth.
You got voice.
Smooth, yeah. So, by now we've agreed that do no harm in design is, I think, maybe a little bit overdue, I hope. Introduce you to a way to incorporate it into your processes. And I think at this stage, we would love to say, go forth and change the world and let's all kind of make everything better. But the truth is, as I mentioned at the beginning, this started in a context of frustration because we were constantly having to convince decision makers that it was important and it was something that we wanted to do. And actually, one of the most common questions I would say that we get from design students and practitioners every time we do a version of this talk is, but how do I take it to my boss? And why do they care? And why would they allocate resources to this? And I've got something for that I can take you through now. So going back to your power as a designer, it comes partly from your connectedness to the commercial space. Designers are really at the vanguard of business and people. And in order to push stakeholders to take the harm that you've identified seriously, it's important to show how it's going to negatively impact the outcome of the project. This is one of my kind of sneaky but not so sneaky kind of inputs that I always put on the table, which is, since do no harm and good research share a lot of characteristics, you can also say, hey, good research produces good outcomes. It's high quality data sets, right? Do no harm is the same. Without do no harm, you're really endangering your data set. And that's something we can go into more detail about later. But that's the first and foremost thing I'd like to say. Obviously, though, again, I'm coming back with my obviouslies. We don't want to downplay the fact that when you're just one actor in a huge ecosystem, and often not even the one with the decision-making power, it can feel really daunting and really tough to take this forward. And luckily and timely are the increasing legislations around sustainability and radical new laws like this one. This is the Norwegian Transparency Act, and it was passed last year. So the Act compels eligible companies to essentially do no harm assess their entire supply chain. So they have to be transparent, hence the name, about potential harm to workers end to end. So if you just close your eyes and imagine a fast fashion brand, any brand that comes into your head first. Now, think that brand now has to account for the rights and safety of their workers from the shop floor all the way back to the factories and to the extracting process where they get their textiles. It's huge. Even though they're not making a big song and dance of this in the media, it's going to domino into supply chains around the world. And that's in addition to the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities, which, not such a catchy name, but super important because it's a classification system specifically designed to prevent greenwashing. So global policies around international and unforeseen harm, they're just getting stronger, and they're multiplying all around the world, even though I've just told you about a lot of European ones. So both thematically and geographically, you're going to see more of these, and there are more on the horizon. Germany and Ireland are already looking at adopting similar acts to the Transparency Act. And of course, the EU's rolled out sustainability directives that are connected to these as well. And that's not all. On the horizon are the historic AI regulations coming out from the EU. And they hope to put controls on the technological advancements in the area. So the Act follows many of the risk assessment principles of the Do No Harm framework. And the declaration, which I think is quite radical also, states that Parliament's priority is to make sure that AI systems used in the EU are safe, transparent, traceable, non-discriminatory, and environmentally friendly. That's pretty huge. It's a pretty complex and broad kind of act. So maybe you're thinking, why is this lady talking me through a bunch of policies and laws so early in the morning? And the reason is because decision makers aren't always going to care about doing the right thing or, mitigating harm or being more ethical. But you know what they are going to care about? The huge shifts in legal and social climates within which they have to operate a business. This is what we take to the decision makers to tell them, you can come for it or it can come for you. Do no harm will be a standard practice, and it's better that you get ahead of it than to let it kind of wash over you.
Yes. So I think historically we have often championed simplicity as a core value to achieve in our work. But after what we've gone through, we believe it's time to move away from simplicity and advocate for complexity. You didn't see that coming, right? Yes, so accepting that engaging with complex topics and problems which we are surrounded by in this society do require us to slow down and allocate appropriate time and effort. And along the same line, when we talk about Do No Harm and the framework, we're often asked for a cheeky checklist or a Do No Harm hack. But the concept of harm changes constantly and will evolve in the future. So as designers, we need to look critically at whatever situation, interaction, and process we're part of to be able to prevent it. And anyway, as much as we are here to talk about the Do No Harm framework, we spent a lot of time to talk about the Do No Harm framework, but our overall ambition is to actually cultivate a do no harm mindset, because this framework is just one way to spur that shift. It's a starting point, it's an introduction. There are many other approaches like trauma-informed design, circularity, regenerative design, system-oriented design, inclusive design, design justice, and many more. All these practices also wants to bring responsibility and accountability within our practice. And there will be always new tools and new approaches, but I think for us it's less maybe about the tools and more about the ambition that we have. And we said already this, but we are working in an industry that contributes to an economic system of inequity. So we have to be intentional in both maintaining an ethical approach while still functioning within our roles. And we know sometimes we feel like we have little agency or decision power, but in our work, we do get the chance to decide what design can do for people, the environment, and wider society. And design academics Dan Abdullah and Pedro de Oliveira talk about minor gestures as localized, subversive acts that can be performed to expand limits of a given system. They're radical in exposing, addressing, and tackling the root cause. They do not replace the need and demand to dismantle institutional power, nor the collective organized struggle towards systemic change. Instead, a minor gesture is to be viewed as a build-up and a place to start for change. So for us, minor gestures towards a do no harm mindset in your team and in your organization could be as simple as asking a difficult question in a workshop or establishing an intentional and ethical design goal for the project from the start, or weighing up the costs and benefits before an intervention takes place. because incremental changes do matter when they work towards a shared goal. And importantly, of course, an intention to be better is great, but in do no harm style, impact, however small it may feel in that specific moment, is more important than your intent.
Okay. That's really the end of our framework per se, but it would be remiss not to mention that as much as we want to take credit for all of this for the last 5 years, it's not just me and Giulia that's been working on this. We are privileged enough to be standing here on stage with you, but lots of people named above, and I hope you recognize some of these names, and these universities, design schools. So the School of Architecture and Design in Oslo, the School of Visual Design, my brain is shut down. The SVA in New York, and of course the Politecnico di Milano, which I say with a shaking voice next to the Italian.
You've done great.
Thank you. All contributed to this work. We've workshopped this material maybe 13, 14 times by this point, and lots of these students and practitioners have contributed. So thank you to them. Here's some content we nerded out to. I'll give you a second to take a picture if you want. There's a ton more. It's 5 years of reading and and discussing. 1, 2, 3, and we're out. And if you're in New York or you know anybody in New York, on the 17th of October, we're holding a Do No Harm event that's a bit broader, and it's about ethical practice within creative industries. I'll give you 3 seconds to take a snap of this QR code. And in the meantime, I'll tell you, you don't have to wear glasses to work at Design It. I know it feels like that, but it helps. I mean, Thank you very much for listening to us today. Thanks, everyone.